Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome back to the Property Investor Podcast. I'm delighted to introduce Andrew Craig back to the podcast. Andrew, welcome back. It's been a couple of years.
Has it really been a couple of years? I
Has
was
been a
trying to
couple of
think.
years.
I'm embarrassed to say I meant to go and remind myself of it. And is this our third one?
I think this is our third,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I was hoping that we would have done one a year ago, but time just flew by last year. Last
Yeah.
year was a bit of a wild year. I'm going to come straight out of the blocks and congratulate you on your excellent fourth book in the series, How to
That
Own
is
the
immense.
World
Very, very kind of you. And I
Under
saw,
30.
we should perhaps say for the benefit of anybody watching that I didn't ask you to put a review up. You did it unilaterally,
I
or at least you
did.
said you were going to. Yeah.
I
But I
did.
really thank you very much.
Well, look, so by way of people who don't know either myself or Andrew wrote what I think is the best book ever written on personal finance, and I discovered it in 2018. And I found this in my office today. So this is the original
Brilliant.
copy I owned. And as you can see, not only have I broken the spine of it, but there's a million tabs on it, and I always listen to books, so it's unusual for me to get a hard copy. So this is one of maybe I'd say 10 books that I have listened to and written over in the process.
Well, that because that version, I don't. Well, maybe I did do an audio book, but because that was the second self-published version, the black one you're holding up, and then we
Right,
got a
okay.
big deal with a big publisher, and then I went into the studio and did a proper audio book, and now they're all on Spotify and all that good stuff.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So you probably would have struggled to listen to it as an audiobook originally.
Well, it was originally it's about 20 YouTube tiny like YouTube. There was a YouTube series that I think
I was,
then
yeah,
became
someone else did that for me, like Google Books or something. It's amazing.
right.
They just somebody will say, "Oh, your book's on YouTube or whatever," but it's I don't know whether it's AI or it's like, but it's like, great, that's good.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And now you have surpassed yourself by writing an even better version, which is How to Under the World Under 30. And I messaged you about this, but like that that is the book that I have gifted all the young people that I know over Christmas. And obviously, for the benefit of YouTube, I would want to have a copy on my desk. But what's interesting is every single copy has now disappeared from the
Oh my
house,
goodness.
which
Well, I
means
can answer
everybody.
the obligatory. I've got one, obviously. I've always got
Thanks.
four of my
We'll
books
have to
there.
come back to that.
Well, I'm really touched, and I hope you gave them something slightly more fun than a book on personal
No, that's all
finance.
they got. That's all they got, and some
No,
wise.
no Quality Street or anything, just to sort of
Hey,
soften the blow.
hey,
Yeah.
we live in interesting times. Right, let's get straight into the podcast. So, um,
Awesome.
I like to start the year by kind of having a little bit of a reflection about just on this one question, which is on a personal level, what was I meant to have learned from last year? On the
Mm,
basis that if you don't learn the lessons from a previous year, you're kind of destined to repeat them. And some of those
yeah.
lessons can be jarring, can't they? And that you don't
Yeah.
necessarily need repeating. So I want to just ask you to give us like one reflection. So what is one thing that you think we as investors ought to have learned from 2025 as a valuable lesson?
Well, I mean, from given how kind you've just been about it all, I mean, I first wrote the first edition of my books, I think 13 years ago, from 14 years ago to 13 years ago before it was then published.
Mhm.
And, one of the overriding themes was one of the big ideas was the fact that there's inflation is much higher than people actually realize it is. And the government, government agencies on both sides of the Atlantic and indeed all over the world kind of torture and twist the numbers around to make inflation actually the sort of headline inflation is 2% number actually is in no way reflective of people's real world experience of how much their life is costing. And there are a number of reasons for that, one of which is that they basically don't include property in that thought process. So for most people, whether you're paying a mortgage or rent, property is going to be your very biggest expense unless you're very wealthy. So the fact that it doesn't really take account of the fact that house prices are skyrocketing is to me somewhat disingenuous. If you're telling me that inflation's 2% when my rent's up 30% in the last few years, that's not very helpful. And there are an awful lot of other reasons why inflation doesn't really reflect the true debasement of the currency, right? And so when you contemplate building wealth and doing your best to become wealthy and comfortably off in your life, this was one of the two really big themes of my book. One is that human progress is the number one investment theme of them all. So believe in global growth, believe the world's getting better, population growth, technology, and everything else. And if you have a financial exposure to that, you will do better than people who do not have a financial exposure to that.
Mhm.
That's pretty easy to evidence because, in 1985, global GDP was about $12 trillion. By the
Mhm.
end of this year, it will be more like $120 trillion. So, if you have a financial exposure to that growth, you're going to do well. But partly related to that is just that inflation really is structurally higher than most people understand it to be, and that's why so many people feel kind of worse off than they were in previous years without really understanding why.
Mhm.
Because the inflation numbers are nonsense. Sorry, that's my typically long answer to your question. But so last year, what was the best performing asset class of all?
Mhm.
Precious metals, gold and silver, and obviously they've had a big lurch in the last few weeks, which was always going to happen because that's what happens when anything goes up X 100% as silver has, or more than 100%, in not in pretty short order in case of gold. So to me, what happened in precious metals last year, without wanting to be kind of annoyingly smuggus maximus, I've been writing about that for more than 10 years. Well, in fact, nearly 20 years in terms of sort of blog output and making the case to my city muckers in jobs and stuff, many of whom keep emailing me going, thanks so much. I've actually got loads of gold now, and it's a significant part of my net worth. And I never would have even thought about it if you hadn't sort of bored on about it in 2005 or whenever we were colleagues. And I just think that, apart from being smug and saying, look, I've been predicting this for 20 years. More important than that is just that it bears, it's rather than just being right when it comes to the price performance of any financial asset. The more important thing is, why were you right? And I think that points up all of the case I've been making for many, many years about currency debasement, about fiat currencies, about how that impacts people's real lives. That is why young people can't get on the property ladder, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And all of these things, a big part of my work, as you know, is that financial markets are not just important to learn about to kind of become wealthy. They're important to learn about because they're absolutely critical for society. And one
Mhm.
of Britain's biggest problems is because we are, factually, and I can cite all sorts of stats. Somebody said a very rude word about me the other day because he'd heard me say on a podcast that I said, most people know nothing about finance.
Mhm.
And I did the standard thing of just ignore the trolls. But in my head, I was sort of fuming and brewing up all the numbers that 60% of people when surveyed don't understand compound interest. Only 15% of British adults have an ISA, and of that 15%, two-thirds of them have two tech stocks. So they're going to get hosed when the next, and. People are factually, financially very, very illiterate in this country and indeed beyond.
Mhm.
And, that has huge problems for people as individuals, but it is also a big part of why Britain is in the pickle it is in, but economically and societally, more or less, obviously. And that's why I'm kind of very mission driven about it. So I guess, yeah, so last year, the performance of precious metals kind of really showed the points I've been making about monetary debasement, and for I think an increasing percentage of the population is kind of more aware of these issues just because they're saying, as ever, the press doesn't talk about
Mhm.
the real reasons for this happening. They just go, look at silver. I've made loads of money in silver, or my friends made loads of money in gold. But you need to look under the hood and understand that these are very important signifiers of what's going on in the world economy and how people should behave.
And I do want to delve into some of the mechanics around the gold market and why it is behaving in the extraordinary way it is. I'd be interested in your views as to who you think the marginal buyers are that are therefore moving the price. But before we get into that, you talk about.
Okay, we'll get into that, but so don't forget central banks when it comes to gold. We'll come back to that.
We'll come back to that, but I'm
Mm.
interested like a layer below that as well as well.
Mm.
Why are they getting so much greater exposure? I've got my own thoughts about it, but I'm more
Mm.
interested in yours. But just if like pausing on this concept of inflation, it is interesting, isn't it? That I think, well, one, I think we can agree that any government statistic can largely be ignored because it's going to be largely manipulated. There's the hedonic adjustments and all the rest
Yeah.
of it to make it rather irrelevant.
Or just egregious incompetence and a total failure to. I mean, like the ONS's methodology for. I can't remember which stat it was, but the ONS have the unique distinction of being out by £500 billion in something or other. They were just, I mean, it's like just a small matter of £500 billion out. And in the whole country, allegedly, Rachel Reeves and others are making policy decisions largely based on numbers that are coming out of the ONS, which is demonstrably not fit for purpose. So you're right. I totally agree with that.
Has your path ever crossed with a guy called Joe Bryan? He produced a very interesting YouTube video called "What's the Problem?" He like formerly of Goldman Sachs.
Is that the what? Yes, I watched about the first 15 minutes of it, and then I got sidetracked by it. But basically explaining all about this, about monetary debasement, and yeah,
Yeah, I mean, one of the very interesting things is that he has a single slide roughly halfway through where
mm,
he is it's a flow chart that basically demonstrates the impact of inflation. And it's really, like quite staggering because
yeah,
it's not just um as you have alluded to, it's not just prices are going up. There is all the human consequences of it.
yeah,
Like
massive.
if we go to like the furthest, most extreme end, and I don't want to like kill the vibe of the podcast, but like deaths of despair. When people have no sense of being able to make human progress, and
Yeah.
and therefore, they feel like there's only kind of one opportunity for them.
Or young people can't get on the property ladder. That's one
Yeah,
of the single most important, and it's like one of the series I'm toying with the title, but I worry I might. You don't bite the hand that feeds you, and don't annoy your audience. But I want to produce a series of videos basically on the theme of turkeys voting for Christmas,
yeah,
which is that so many people are so ignorant of how these mechanisms work. The relationship between bond markets, interest rates, inflation, house prices, wealth inequality,
yeah.
that they ask for things that will deliver 180 degrees the opposite of what would make their lives better because they don't understand. And one of the really big ones there, and it's analogous to the point you're making, is there's this thing called the Cantillon effect. And
Yes.
that is basically that the bigger government is, the more government borrows money from the bond markets and the UK market, that's gilts, the more hundreds of billions of debt we have, or trillions indeed, or hundreds of billions of interest that the government's paying, as it
Mhm.
is now. The more you crowd out the private sector, which is fundamentally more productive, or however you want to argue about what government should or shouldn't do, it's by now it's absolutely unimpeachably true that if you want to launch a rocket into space, much
Yeah.
as Elon Musk's SpaceX got lots of government subsidies from the government, and that was facilitated him being able to launch stuff in space. The reason the government were willing to put how many tens of billions or hundreds of billions of dollars into SpaceX over the last few years is because they launch a kilo or a pound of payload into space at a fraction of the price that NASA could ever do it, right? And that's just one of literally thousands of examples, right? And so if you take all that around, the Cantillon effect basically means that people closest to the money in an inflationary world with monetary debasement and more units of fiat currency being produced, people closest to the money become disproportionately wealthy. So that's hedge fund managers, private equity people, venture capitalists, investment bankers, politicians, the military industrial complex that's close because that's all Pentagon contracts and whatever else. And more prosaically, because what inflation does is it privileges anybody who owns assets. So obviously, if you already are wealthy enough to own a load of property and maybe a load of shares and a load of gold, and in recent years perhaps Bitcoin, or to a certain extent, although it's obviously been weak for a while now, but all of these things go up when there's excessive money printing, excessive government debt. And so the answer is absolutely not more government debt, more money printing, more tax.
Mhm.
Because what all that will do, and this is why, we're getting sort of, sorry, I don't want to be political, but I see somebody like Gary Stevenson,
Mhm.
who's garnered so much attention, and he's diagnosing wealth inequality as a massive societal problem. And I
Mhm.
completely agree with him, but I think he's completely wrong about the cause of that. And
Mhm.
even, he holds himself out as this economist. He's not an economist. He traded short bonds for 10 minutes at Citigroup. And the hubris of that guy to describe himself as the best trader in the world is just factually absolutely not correct. He wasn't even the best trader at Citigroup. It's just, I mean, it blows my mind. It blows my mind that people. Anyway, I'm not the only one making these comments, but good on him for building such a big following by being so hubristic and frankly, he's either dishonest or clueless. It's by factually one of the two. And for him to advocate the policies he advocates, he genuinely does not understand these economic mechanisms because those policies will create more misery, more wealth inequality, disproportionately even wealthier people than we have at the moment. And we've got 2 centuries of evidence that that's how it works. If you have huge government, loads of borrowing, loads of money printing, loads of inflation and currency debasement, the rich get very disproportionately wealthier. I mean, just look at the S&P 500. Why is Jeff Bezos so wealthy? Why is Elon Musk knocking on the door of $1 trillion?
Mhm.
Why are or Mark Zuckerberg, whoever, why are these people so unbelievably disproportionately wealthy in a way that we've not seen since the robber barons of, Cornelius Vanderbilt and the sort of railway barons of John D. Rockefeller and Henry Ford and all of that? It was for a different reason back then. The reason now is because of everything I'm talking about. Is because the only way that Tesla can be valued at 300 times earnings, which if you're a student of equity markets, you should know that no company should ever be valued at 300 times earnings. And if you look at the number of businesses in the S&P 500 that are egregiously, valued on stupid multiples or unprofitable, the S&P's never had, and the Nasdaq never had a higher percentage of unprofitable businesses that are valued at loads. The reason for that is a lot to do with the rise of passive investing, but it's an awful lot to do with this, and that is why these people are so stratospherically wealthy. And I did a podcast with a guy called Tim Price, State of the Markets podcast the other week, and he reminded me of a really good quote, which is fix the money, fix the world.
Mhm.
And the answer to most of the world's problems right now, a lot of the world's problems right now, particularly wealth inequality, are caused by funny money and currency debasement. And the solution is absolutely not more of that.
Mhm. I mean, I think I can say this, and you probably can't. And the solution, I think, potentially for young people is also to read your book, because like you have to be on the right side of it. I
Yeah,
think in the sense that I think we can all wish and hope for change. Like I'm a born optimist, and I would like to end on the subject of optimism in this podcast. But I also think we have to deal with the here and now.
exactly.
As a dad, I suppose, and have it being around, a decent number of young people, you want them to be on the right side of it. And
Yeah.
the solution is, be productive, make as much progress
Uh,
as you can, and
in
and,
owning assets
and
and
own
benefiting from
assets.
compound interest and making sure that, my 2 big themes are own the world and own inflation, right?
Yeah.
Own human progress, own inflation. It's never been easier or more powerful or less expensive to do that than it has in history because of tons of innovation from financial services companies that mean that you can have an app and you can invest £1 a month if you want on some of them, which
Yeah.
is,
Have
you
you,
know,
I, I I get your point about turkeys voting for Christmas. I've literally just
mm.
finished a book in the last sort of day or so. In fact, yesterday. Have you ever come across a book called End Times?
The name rings a bell, but I couldn't tell you any
It's
more than I've
very interesting.
vaguely
It's
heard of it.
it,
Yeah.
it's along similar themes as to like the fourth turning that the
Yeah.
2020s are likely to be volatile. It's a long time since
Yeah.
the Second World War,
Yeah. Yeah.
and
The generational cohort theory of, yeah, yeah,
yeah, that we've forgotten the horrors of war, therefore we're going to repeat
yeah,
them. And we're seeing rising levels of chaos, and falling levels of stability, and eventually that will course correct, and we'll be back off to the race in the 2030s. Just as to your point about, I suppose, turkeys voting for Christmas. One of the interesting things in that book is they talk about the oversupply of, let's say, people at degree level. So
yeah,
our universities are taking on lots of young people, and they're taking on a lot of debt, and in theory taking on degrees that aren't necessarily going to propel them further into the future. Where I think it was probably a little bit different in the 90s, where if
mm,
you got a degree, you would probably get a good job off the back of that degree, and you
yeah,
probably didn't need to do a master's, and you definitely didn't need to get a PhD to get a half decent job. But now, we've seen that kind of inflation in the educational model as well, where
yeah,
people who want to get like particular jobs in finance, let's say, you're hearing them talk about doing like a PhD at some point in their
yeah,
subject,
yeah,
which is
yeah,
extraordinary if you think about that. The premise of this book, which you made me think about, is that we are going to end up with a population of people who have invested a lot in degrees that aren't necessarily what they're worth. And understandably, and I say this with real sympathy, they're going to be frustrated and wonder,
yeah,
like, but I'm really smart and I've got this really good degree. and I've worked pretty hard to get here, but
Yeah.
yet there isn't what I expected at the end.
Yeah.
There isn't this light at the end of the tunnel, and whose fault is that?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And it's likely to be that blame and anger is likely to be directed probably to the wrong place. Uh,
Rich people, governments,
yeah,
boomers. Well,
yeah.
I mean, there are so many things to say about that. Like, so firstly, you don't have to. So, who came up with a wonderful quote? When you find yourself on the side of the majority, it's time to think again. It's like, swimming against the tide has often throughout history been the right thing to do. And so when my dad went to university in the early 70s or late 60s, he was 5% of British people went to university, and like I can't remember, 5 to 10% of them got firsts.
Yeah.
Now it's like 55% of people go to university and 33% of them, a third of them get firsts. So funnily enough, without wanting to be harsh, as a statement of fact, not opinion, the value of a first in whatever or a 2-1 in whatever has devalued. And by the way, it already devalued loads from our parents' era by the time I was at uni, but not, that's discontinued. So continued onwards. So without question, the value of a degree, there's been massive inflation and which has eroded, debased the value of a degree. So the fact that you have a piece of paper that says I have a 2-1 from whatever university, it will, when degrees were very, very gilt edged and gold plated and incredibly hard to get, and only 5% of people got them, of course they meant more.
Mhm.
And if you did engineering at Edinburgh University or whatever to go and work on the North Sea oil rigs, or in Texas for, a big oil company or something, you actually had accrued a lot of the skills required to actually tangibly do that job. Whereas
Mhm.
an awful lot of degrees that people are studying nowadays don't give you any tangible skills to do a job. So it shouldn't be any surprise to us that people are struggling, and people can blame whoever they want to blame, but not, it's not really the fault of wealthy people or people who've succeeded in the system. Because the irony is, what I wanted to go back to is that point about when you find yourself on the side of the majority, it's time to think again. The people who are doing best in recent years are often the people who left school very young and just cracked on doing, for example, something in social media.
Mhm.
Because if you want to be a YouTuber like Mr. Beast, or I don't know whether Mr. Beast went to college or not. I would guess probably not, but maybe he did. But in this world of where the attention economy and all these other non kind of conventional ways of making money, and making vastly more money than you'll ever make as a salaried employee, right? Because you scale to the world.
Mhm.
Um, the most important, the single most important factor in whether you succeed with that sort of approach to economic life is consistency and time.
Yeah.
So that's why there's so many sort of people who started YouTubing, or even look at Justin Bieber as a spurious example, or Lord in New Zealand, who's a great little singer you may or may not
Mhm.
be familiar with.
Yeah.
Or,
Yeah.
these are all people who started posting YouTube videos of their attempts at doing music when they were like in their early teens or 10, 11, 12 years old. And there are so many examples of this who are now like massive global superstars, because the role of time and compounding is so important,
Mhm.
because nothing happens for years and years and years. But then if you get to like 20,000, then you go 40,000, 80,000, 160,000. Within a few years, you're at a million. But that's going to take 15, 18, 20 years. And one of the reasons that few people succeed in that trajectory is that human nature is such that most people give up like quite a few years before you're ever going to get the benefit of the exponential impact and the compounding that finally delivers the, I mean, I was actually just talking to somebody yesterday about how, so I've spent 2 and a bit years working really hard on our YouTube channel, like
Yeah.
2 long form videos a month, all the post production, all
Mhm.
the emails to promote them, all the social posts. It's a lot of work, and I'm really proud of them. And da da da. And I've got to, I think we're at 18,500 subs, basically from a standing start, which I'm told is really good. And then I
Mhm.
look at my 6-year-old son as he switches on YouTube, and there's like Mr. Ham, the hamster,
Yeah.
channel, right? Who's got
Yeah.
like, I don't know, 9 million viewers. And there's some 22-year-old girl in California who's got a thing aimed at kids that's all bright colors and stuff, where she basically makes fish tanks out of Lego and stuff like that. And she's got like 20 million followers. And these people are literally, I'm doing all this graft for a really serious, dull, old manny kind of world of, well, I still value added, right? I hope
Yeah.
to add a
Yeah.
lot of value to and improve the lives of my audience. But somebody making a maze out of toilet rolls and putting a hamster in it with a small camera is making literally millions of dollars a month out of that. But
Well, maybe Andrew, that's the future for all of us.
correct. But look, I mean, to your point on that, the most it's all about education, 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 and knowing the way the world's traveling and reading the runes on these big directional changes. And it's been abundantly obvious for years to anybody who takes an interest in such things that, of course, tertiary education is going to be devalued because if anything that goes from 5% of the population to 50% of the population, it's going to be devalued. And if there are only 15% of jobs in any market that are high paying jobs, then 35% of the people with degrees are not going to get high paying jobs. It's not, that's just very, very simple mathematics, isn't it? So,
I want to circle back to this towards the end of the podcast
mm,
because I want one of the key objectives of the podcast is to get practical solutions to
mm,
the themes that we're like seeing. And I want to circle back to that towards the end of the podcast in terms of, where young people should look for opportunity. But before we get there, I do want to sort of just look at the market stuff, which is so if we return to this theme of gold. So when I read the first version of your book that I came across in 2018. It was the
yeah,
first time anyone had ever mentioned gold to me. And I remember where I was sitting when I was kind of finishing a chapter and I was with a group of like business friends. And I said, "Does anybody here own gold?" And they all looked at me as if I had grown two heads.
yeah, exactly.
And they were not all, and I don't say this as a criticism, but they were also not interested in starting a conversation about it. It was like,
Yeah.
whatever, we're not interested. Um, and so obviously now you look like a genius, don't you? Because
Mm.
you put it in your book.
Everyone said you were talking about gold when it
Yeah.
was at $300. When Gordon Brown sold all of our government's gold,
Yeah.
of course.
And so, and you should take the kudos of that because you deserve it because you
Mm,
put it in a book. Um,
mm.
but what are we meant to, what is the signal that we should be getting from the shift in the gold price, and who are the marginal buyers that are moving the price,
Mm.
and why is that happening now?
So, wow, that's okay. So, I mean, what the precious metals market is telling us is that, which a lot of people have been talking about for 20, 30 years, is that,
Mhm.
Nixon came off the gold standard in 71. The world has been on some kind of gold standard or gold standard proxy since the Victorian age, basically. And I could highly recommend Dominic Frisby's book, The Secret History of Gold, which was just published. Is
That was my Christmas book, and I even gifted that to my dad. And my dad is not interested in gold, but there's a couple of chapters in there that are
ah,
absolutely breathtaking.
I mean, basically, the gold was. I mean, if you really, really get into it, gold is one of the absolute driving factors of the Second World War.
Yeah,
I mean, basically everywhere that Nazis went, they got into Poland, they got into the Czech Republic. The first thing they did was take all of the physical bullion out of the central
yeah,
banks, put it on a train, and send it back to Germany. It was,
yeah,
and that book is incredible about how that's basically what Jason and the Argonauts, the Golden Fleece was actually about gold. Through there's all these threads through the whole of history and conflict and everything else. And I just found it absolutely fascinating. But the since 71, we've been in this sort of great big game of money merry-go-round, and there's a great website called WTF happened in 1973 or
yeah.
71, sorry. I checked that out because to your point about you were asking earlier about what does inflation do in terms of despair and income inequality and people not being able to get on the housing ladder, and it's insane if you really scratch the surface. It's insane, and that is why wiser heads in previous eras largely backed currency with something that limited the supply of currency. And maybe Bitcoin, obviously, one of the big arguments for Bitcoin is it does that by limiting the supply. And that's a very nuanced discussion. But this does seem to be signaling, if not the end of the post 71 fiat currency era, because I don't think it will end because there are too many vested interests, many of whom have very, very large militaries.
Mhm.
But it's certainly a change, I think. And so to your question is, when you read the runes about any big structural change to a financial market like this, which I'm not that, why was I able to write about this 20 years ago? Because of a load of stuff I'd read written by people far older and smarter than me, right? And so I was only distilling ideas that came from other people. But whenever there's one of these changes, it's sort of a trickle, a trickle, a trickle, then a flood, right? And that's true of everything. That's the compound effect. As it goes back to what I was just saying about hamster YouTube channels. I mean, you have a few hundred subscribers, a few more hundred subscribers, a few thousand subscribers. It takes years and years and years and years, and suddenly it goes, a million, 2 million, 4 million, 8 million, 16 million, and you have somebody with a hamster channel with 16 million subscribers. And it's true of equities, it's true of all sorts of financial markets, and it's true of gold. And the tipping point, that's why you get fear and greed and bubbles and crashes, and because then the tipping point goes in the opposite direction. And I think what's happened with gold is there's all this geopolitical stuff. I do think that Trump and his cabinet, there's something afoot because they're well aware that with knocking on $40 trillion of outstanding US government debt, this is what really is behind all the tariff machinations, and it's sort of realpolitik for the first time in many decades.
Mhm.
And actually there is method in their madness. I think Trump, appears to be a fool, but actually, if you look at what he's achieving with some in terms of appropriating more wealth for America. I don't have a view on that. I'm not making a comment on that ethically or morally. I'm just saying that if that's your job as the president of a country, in stark contrast to what our government are doing, which is making Britain immeasurably less wealthy. So, whatever your views on warm, cuddly social stuff, just on pure economic, making your citizens wealthier and therefore ergo potentially having better lives, more comfortable lives. We are 180 degrees doing the opposite of what we should be doing, and the Americans are, kidnapping the president of Venezuela is taking things a bit far, and annexing Greenland is pretty feisty, and it is a bit. I was just saying a minute ago, I'm not comparing the Americans to the Nazis, absolutely not. But why do countries do these things for economic reasons? But
Acquisition of
basically,
resources.
sorry, what's that?
It's the acquisition of resources, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And I'm not a big fan of that. I hope that we can go to a sort of Star Trek future where
Yeah.
which to give him his due, I know a lot of people hate Elon Musk these days, but if you actually listen to what he says, that's what he wants. He wants all humans to have very abundant lives and live in harmony with the planet, and ultimately have an extra, get off the planet in case there's a great big asteroid that comes along and kills human consciousness, but which are
Yeah.
all pretty laudable aims. And I think that's probably why I parted company with Trump, one of the many reasons. But to go back to the gold thing specifically, basically what's happened is it's very clear that the rest of the world, and China in particular, have much less confidence in the dollar system. We've basically had the whole economic system has been based on dollar payments since the end of the Second World War, and that isn't working for China or Russia or a lot of the Middle East or a lot of Latin America or India or Turkey or much of Africa. And actually, I mean, I've made this point before. It all sounds very conspiracy theory, but it's not. It's just abundantly clear. What are the countries that tried to come off the dollar global system in the last 20 or 30 years? And they are Iraq, Iran, and Libya. It's like basically whenever that American, because America has what I think. Who was the famous president of France after the Second World War? Who's going to be assassinated in the day of the jackal. It will come back to me. President, I'm annoyed I can't remember, but he called it the exorbitant privilege that America had of having its basically the global reserve currency. It makes Americans disproportionately wealthy. That's why they support it with blood and with tanks and military and planes.
You often see that meme that's quite popular in the Bitcoin space, which is the US dollar is backed by nothing, and then you see a picture of an enormous armada of
Yeah,
military
yeah.
vehicles moving towards your country, and like a question mark.
Exactly, which is also, and I've thrown that at Bitcoin enthusiasts because it's like they were like, well, it's decentralized, and nobody can control it if you've got your own private key, and it's like, well, yeah, but whilst any nation has a monopoly of violence, i.e., judiciary, police force, military, within its geographical boundaries, it
Mhm.
doesn't matter if your Bitcoin is dematerialized and in computer nodes all over the world if you can be arrested for owning it. In
Mhm.
the same way, like if that's the law that gets passed, I'm not saying that will happen, but I'm saying
Yeah.
that's an ever-present risk with anything, right?
And
Um,
then there's like the more simple things, like what are the closing the off ramps, and that causes very practical problems for people if you close all the off ramps.
which is happening in the UK right
Yeah,
now,
exactly.
on my social feed.
So in terms of do you think do you think this move to away from the dollar towards gold let's say from a Chinese perspective,
Mm.
is that they have simply been patient. And now is just the time. I once heard this quote, which apparently originated from a Chinese leader, which is, don't shine too brightly.
Yeah, exactly. Under
Basically,
the radar.
let's
Yeah.
make our progress. Let people believe what they want to
Mm.
believe. And to be honest, there is some wisdom in that. I think like building things in private until you're ready to
Yeah.
launch, I think is a great idea.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, is it strategic that people have just been patiently waiting their time until their own resources, their own infrastructure was built out, their influence over other countries through infrastructure programs?
Yeah.
Is it that, or was the catalyst the sanctions against Russia with the Ukraine war, where obviously their assets were frozen throughout Europe and
Yeah.
elsewhere, and countries waking up and thinking, actually, we don't. Those assets are very vulnerable, and therefore we would
Yeah.
ideally rotate out of them. Or is it a mixture of the both, or is it something?
It's mi It's all the above. I mean, the Chinese have been playing a blinder because they've been doing this for 30 plus years, right? They've just been quietly accumulating gold on the sly through London. They're the biggest producers of gold in the world. They've been taking gold out of places like South Africa and wherever it's mined. The Chinese have had a big hand in getting hold of a lot of it, and that's actually all detailed in Dominic's book. And they have. I can't remember what the numbers are, but they're supposed to have like 2,500 tons of gold reserves. They probably have 40,000 or whatever it is. Is ridiculous, which is like four times what the US is supposed to have, and almost certainly doesn't have because Fort Knox hasn't been audited for many
Yeah,
many years. And it's all. I mean,
yeah.
it's crazy when you actually the Germans asked for a load of their gold back a few years ago, and still hasn't been shipped back to Germany. It's like, what's going
And there's
on?
that great joke, isn't there, about the president discovers there's no gold at Fort Knox and he says double the guards.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, exactly right. Which is, I think, is in Dominic's book. Exactly. Well, you know,
yeah.
the other one that's amazing is which I'd first come across this in David McWilliams's brilliant book, Money: A Story of Humanity, which I can highly recommend on all this
Mhm.
sort of stuff as well. Brilliant Irish economist and academic who wrote this book. Annoyingly, I reached out to him through his website, whatever, to try and get him to give me a praise quote from the new book, and he didn't come back to me. I was very put out. But anyway, well, not least because I quoted his book in my book, um, but talking about how the Wizard of Oz, which is one of the most successful, famous, feature length movies of all
Mhm.
time in history, like one of the most cherished children's films,
Mhm.
is actually a parable about the gold standard, like
Yes.
the
Yeah.
yellow brick
Yellow Brick
road,
Road.
and then the fact that Oz, the all great and all powerful Oz, is
Yeah.
actually, it's basically the central bank. Like when you pull back the curtain, there's nothing there, and it's like
Yeah.
it's fascinating. And the Tin Man was silver, and it's really
Yeah.
when you learn about, because that was one of the biggest when that book was originally written. One of the biggest debates in America was whether or not to be on a gold standard or a silver standard or whatever. And so I
Yeah.
find that sort of stuff completely fascinating because it kind of helps you think about how well it reminds you just how many centuries this has all been germane to the
Mhm.
human experience, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, but China have been accumulating very slowly. Everybody smart has been accumulating slowly for a while. And why is that? Well, the theory is that if China wakes up one day, turns around and goes, right, we're going to have a gold-backed renminbi,
Mhm.
then an awful lot of the world's trade will then move to being traded in the Chinese bloc, which will of course be the Chinese, Russian, Turkish, whatever bloc, Mint or whatever. No, Mint, Mexico, India, Nigeria. I always forget which one's which, but a lot of the world's trade will then be outside of the dollar system, which takes an awful lot of power away from America.
Mhm.
And but to your point about let's go back to what can we tangibly do. I think you should tangibly have an exposure to precious metals, like an appropriate sort of amount of your mix to monetize slash this reality slash hedge your exposure to other stuff that might go the opposite direction. I've written about that at length.
Mhm.
There's not much any of us can do about the great big machinations of superpowers and geopolitics. I mean,
Yeah.
if trying to do that, who knows what it will mean, but basically if you do your best to put a little bit by every month for 20 to 40 years of your life into a
Mhm.
sensible mix of investments, as long as there isn't the sort of apocalyptic nuclear Armageddon or a pandemic which actually kills everyone instead of only 10 million people or whatever COVID killed. Um, by the way, when I say only for people on audio, I don't mean only
Yeah.
at all. I'm just
Yeah.
saying, when you consider that the bubonic plague took away 30 to 40% of the whole world's population,
Mhm.
we had a lucky escape with COVID, I reckon. But there's not much you can do about that, And I also always say that investing is a very asymmetric bet, right? Because the outcomes of doing it, of
Mhm.
learning enough, and thank you for
Mhm.
your very kind comments on my book. I hope my book gets people like a long way towards knowing enough to take tangible steps and
Yeah.
sort this out, right? Doing that has an enormous amount of upside probabilistically, and really the only way that it won't have upside is if in that Armageddon scenario.
Mhm.
But you would have been like it would have been a better decision to invest whether or not the Armageddon scenario comes along, because if the Armageddon scenario happens, then you're not going to be worried about your investment performance. And
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
so I
Yeah.
mean, I always kind of, it's a bit like a lot of people now, which is a separate discussion, but I know that I actually felt this myself for a while before I sort of did a better job at news hygiene and reading the right books and having the right inputs. But what's the point in having children? The world's so screwed. Global warming, the environment, blah, blah, whatever.
Yeah.
And empirically, an awful lot of young people in this country and in America and in the developed worlds feel that way. Like, what's the point in having children? I don't want to have children because the world's so screwed. And that,
But that
that
that is by design. There is there's a whole school of thought where I mean that's like an ideology that is communicated to people that human beings are bad for the planet and people shouldn't have children and all the rest of it.
Yeah,
Whereas
which and I don't know if you read my fourth book, sorry, my third book, Our Future is Biotech, but a huge part, I don't know if we get into this, but a so there are unquestionably challenges, right? We have put heavy metals into our soils. That's affecting agriculture. That's part of why people have loads of, America's got really bad health, partly because their agricultural supply chain's so bad. We've
yeah.
got microplastics, running through our rivers into lakes and streams and rivers and into the oceans, and we've got, fishing and problems with our fish supplies, overfishing. We've got, all this stuff is real. But at the same time, there are a couple of things to say. There are tens of thousands of commercial entities out there in the world
Mhm.
working with exponential technologies, making huge progress in sorting out most of these problems.
Mhm.
Seriously, empirically, I mean, I put loads of it in my book. Like, there's $90 billion that's been committed in a series of conferences to ocean cleanup and to, protecting Australia's Great Barrier Reef and to, basically doesn't make the news. There's
Mhm.
mangrove swamps in India have doubled, tiger populations have doubled.
Mhm.
There's a huge amount of reforestation all over the world. There are loads and loads of NGOs working to, roll back the destruction of habitats here, there, and everywhere. And the key point I'd make, and an awful lot of these have an exponential trajectory. So
Mhm.
sorting out microplastics in our oceans or heavy metals in our agricultural soils
Mhm.
is not a trajectory that's sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's a 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, 32. And in a decade, you've totally repaired the problem. In the
Mhm.
same way that clean or alternative power generation, which by the way, I'm not a big fan of for totally different reasons, but again, if you, let's say nuclear, which I think is a much better option, but broadly, if you replace big uh, polluting fossil fuel generation in an exponential trajectory, within a few years, the whole world has sorted that out, and that people like
Mhm.
Elon Musk believe in that and working on that
Mhm.
sort of thing. The reason that no one thinks about this stuff and no one believes in this is firstly because people are rubbish at understanding exponentials. Like, we see it time and time again. Our brains just don't work in an exponential
Yeah.
way. And
Yeah.
AT&T were asked to estimate the number of mobile phones there'd be in the world by the year 2000 in the early 90s, and they estimated 1 million. They're out
Yeah.
by a factor of 100.
Yeah.
And so the smartphone, because I have this all the time. I'm speaking in Dubai on Monday at this massive biotech conference. This is all in my head because I mean, I want to talk
Yeah.
about these amazing exponentials. But so that you could have cobbled together a smartphone technologically in about 1995, like a
Yeah.
touch screen,
Hmm.
a RAM chip, a small speaker, etc., etc. It wouldn't have looked anything like an iPhone or a Samsung or whatever. But
Hmm.
you could have just about built something like that if you were DARPA or NASA or, at the very cutting edge of kind of what humans were capable of at that point.
Yeah.
And it would have cost $100 million
Hmm.
to build one.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay. So if you'd said something in 1995, oh, by 2025, 7 billion people in the world will have one of these things, they'd be like, they'd look at you like you're mental. They'd be like, of course,
Yeah.
this just cost us $100 million to make this. Now, we've made more than 7 billion of them in the world, right? 30 years later. And that is how powerful exponential is. So, firstly, when people contemplate all these environmental problems in the world, they are unaware of how strong how brilliant the technology is, and that's why I wrote about biotech. And they have no intuitive grasp of how exponential trajectories work, and therefore all these problems could be a problem, a problem, a problem, a problem, and then disappear,
Hmm.
like literally. And we've got a fair bit of evidence. And the other reason that nobody's aware of this stuff and nobody talks about it is, again, something I've written about a lot, is negative press bias.
Hmm.
So empirically, a ridiculous percentage of everything that you see in the mainstream press and by extension on social media has a huge negative bias because war, school shootings, pandemics, if it bleeds, it leads. There are some great academics who've written about this. Steven Pinker at Harvard, there's a load of
Yeah, yeah.
stuff about this.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but it's an empirical, undisputable fact that like 90, I don't know, it's 98% or whatever it is empirically of the press that you see we come home from the office, we sit down in a dark suit, we switch the TV on, and we choose to spend half an hour having somebody answer the question, what is the worst thing that happened in the world today? In a
Yeah,
dark, it's like, why do we, it's insane. And so what that does is it completely distorts everyone's genuine understanding and appreciation of the state of the world. Because the number actually, Gaza is horrendous. Yemen is horrendous. The plight of the Rohingya people on the border of, Rangoon and Bangladesh is horrendous. And by the way, hasn't been in the news for a long time. Syria is horrendous. Paraguay is not that great.
yeah.
There are an awful lot of places in the world where there's Ukraine, obviously. There's a lot going on. But the fact, empirically, is that a very large number of billions of human beings today are infinitely wealthier, healthier, longer lived, more peaceful. Your risk of dying in war or from any other kind of homicide, crime rates in London are actually massively down.
Hmm.
There's a fair bit of knife crime has been a bit tricky, but knife crime in the context of 9, 10 million people in London is I think I can't remember what the stats are, but it's definitely less than 1,000 people a year are killed from knife crime. Now, if you lived in Victorian London, the time
Yeah,
of
yeah.
Jack the Ripper, your chance of being killed in some sort of thug coming and whacking over the head as you came out of a pub was immeasurably higher than it is today, right? But everyone's got this totally distorted idea of the state of the world and thinks the world is immeasurably worse than it is, and they have no confidence in our ability as a species to solve these big problems, and they're wrong, by the
And,
way.
and
um,
as you say, that like the reason for that is what people are bombarded with. So,
and what we choose to consume.
yeah,
And the other thing is people choose to consume short form content
yeah.
when what you need to consume is long form content. People, sorry, I apologize for my phone being on. I thought it
Don't
was
worry.
on silent, but it's
We
ringing on
can't hear
my.
this end.
Okay,
But
I thought you could hear it on
it,
my
it's
Apple.
it, it's worth like doubling down on a reference that you gave there, which is Professor Steven Pinker, and in particular,
Yeah,
he wrote the book Enlightenment Now. The book is worth
yeah,
actually reading, but if you can't bring yourself to read the book, he
mhm,
did a TED talk on it, which is just a few minutes long. And
yeah,
just as you have alluded to, he just throws up, I think, a handful of charts and says, "Look at human progress." I think the one
yeah,
that really resonated with me was, um, you know, infant mortality. It
yeah.
went from, in
40,
the
40% of under fives in 1800.
yeah, and
40% of
like
under fives dead.
and it goes straight down, to a
Yeah,
very low amount. And then I think there's one which was on people actually killed in war.
yeah,
Even despite the fact that obviously we live in a world of conflict, the actual
yeah.
number is diminishing year by year.
And it's time, compared to World War II, obviously it's tiny. Compared to
Yeah,
Vietnam and South Korea, it's not much.
yeah.
But more importantly, as a percentage of the human experience, like I was dozing through a podcast first thing this morning about the peasants' revolt in Germany in 1500, randomly enough,
Okay.
and like 100,000 German peasants got killed, like basically rising up against the knights and the princes of,
Yeah.
Germany. And all throughout history, men actually, because women didn't go to war, but if you were if you were an elite man, like a knight or a prince, kings went to war. Kings got killed in hand-to-hand combat, even though they were the king, right? And the poor old peasant with a longbow or whatever, or your chance of dying in war was really high, like for many centuries, like most years in most centuries, going back to the beginning of human history. You were very unlikely to live a life where you didn't have to like swing an axe at someone or a sword, or, because your lord would come and knock on the door of your hovel and go, right, we're off to the Middle East to go and kill,
Or, or, or,
Muslims. It's like
or I
really, like,
suppose also like have a trivial accident and die
which
of
would kill you.
trivial
Exactly.
accident. I've just
Sepsis.
discovered an hour ago that a friend of mine broke her foot, and you think about what that would have meant. It
100%.
would you wouldn't be able to farm anymore. Anyway, Andrew,
People didn't have any teeth.
I'm
Most people by the age of 40, before modern dentistry and cleaning our teeth,
yeah,
people used to pull their teeth out because they were so rotten and smelly and horrible. They would literally with no anesthetic. So that you
I,
had all these people, and that's why the expression "teaching grandmothers to suck eggs." I used that expression the other day, and I was like, I don't know where that expression comes from. So I looked it up,
and
and
that's right.
it's because people had no teeth. And so any grandmothers, because most men had died and never got to that old, but elderly ladies that had no teeth used to have to suck eggs.
There you
So
go. I
there you
completely
go.
agree.
Learn something new every day.
I want to bring us back to the States for two more quick points, which is in your book, you have this really interesting conversation analysis of, if somebody is bought into your methodology and they
Yeah,
think, right, I do want to own the world, so I'm going to put some gold in my portfolio. I'm going to have a bit of cash for a bit of rebalancing, but I'm broadly going to own the whole of the equity markets.
yeah, exactly.
Um, then, you then segue into an interesting conversation about kind of the future of the states and you make this point that basically, well, if you don't believe in America for whatever
Yeah,
reason,
yeah,
whether it's the conversation around politics or because you have your worldview, there is the opportunity to buy the entire world but exclude the US. And that made me think and have a bit of a look around. And it's interesting because when you do buy a global equities ETF, you are really 60% allocated to the States because they're
yeah,
always heavily allocated to the States.
exactly.
So if you don't believe in America, you actually have to take a decisive step and
Yeah,
and elect out of it because you're always going to be opted into it. So what's your I mean, I'm definitely not asking you to give advice, but like what's your view on that now? Almost in a sentence, like
yeah. To be clear, that's my view is not to opt out of America. My view is to have either the MSCI World, which is 1,600 stocks. So you've got the 500 American stocks in there, but then you've got another 1,100
yeah.
global stocks from developed markets,
Hmm.
or the FTSE All-World, which is 3,300 stocks, and that includes developing. So that's China and India and Brazil and whatever else, right? And I think probably if you held a gun to my head and said which one of the three would I own for the next 20 years, I'd definitely go FTSE All World. So just have the biggest possible exposure to all these stocks. There are 4,000 stocks in the index. There are three and a bit thousand in the ETF because the 700 smallest ones are basically too small to put into an ETF technically.
Yeah.
And so if you're just going to have the one exposure, and look, that doesn't mean I think Tesla's rubbish. I think Tesla's overvalued. It doesn't mean I don't believe in AI. It doesn't mean I don't think Apple's great. It just means that, that is largely priced in, I think. And the other thing is, you never know when the shoe's going to drop, and there's I firmly believe the next equity correction in US equities is going to be absolutely savage, right? Because it's not just the egregious overvaluation at this point. This is so much more overhyped and overvalued than .com was,
Hmm.
right? So it stands to reason it's probably likely the crash will probably be even more fierce.
Mhm.
And there are a couple of reasons for that. Largely, so one of them is because the madness of crowds can be far more powerful when 2.2 billion people use Meta to communicate than in
Yeah.
the dot-com era where loads of people didn't even have email, right? So you had a huge you had a massive frenzy and a huge bull market and everybody buying dot-com stocks in 98, 99, when the lion's share of the world's population was not even using email yet,
Hmm.
right? Let alone Instagram,
Hmm.
WhatsApp, Facebook, etc. So the reason an awful lot of markets have been such huge bull markets, this bull market in everything, is
Hmm.
partly because the madness. You have a hell of a lot of people who have no understanding of valuation whatsoever, going, "I'm going to buy the S&P 500, or I'm going to buy Bitcoin, or whatever." So when the thing is, as with any cycle based on human psychology and the madness of crowds, is that when that goes into reverse,
Hmm.
the more powerful it's been on the upside, the more powerful it will be on the downside, right?
Yeah.
And then the other one, which has juiced that, which is, I mean, if you want to be cynical and think about conspiracy theories, which I quite enjoy doing from time to time,
Okay.
um, the policy decisions taken by the US government in the last 20-ish years since ETFs were invented, actually 30 years, it was 93, the first one was made. So Vanguard, State Street, and BlackRock have all very, very effectively lobbied basically financially illiterate US congressmen, right?
Hmm.
And no doubt donated to their, fundraising efforts for their re-election campaigns and they have basically made the case that passive investing is always better than active investing, and it's cheaper, and most active fund managers underperform, which is an incredibly unnuanced and unsophisticated view, which I've just made a video series about, by the way, because it's killing capitalism. It
Hmm.
may be in inverted commas right, but that doesn't mean if you see the whole ball game that it's good. So what that has meant that for a whole bunch of structural reasons driven by regulation and policy, a lot of investors in America have been basically shoehorned into passive ETFs. So if you run a Fortune 500 pension fund in Nebraska or Minneapolis or something, and you're not willing to jump a lot of pretty onerous hurdles around form filling, and so to say, actually, I want to put it in Warren Buffett's fund. Actually, you're probably all right with Warren Buffett's fund, but an awful lot of other funds, your fiduciary duty is basically put all that money in an S&P 500 ETF, right? An S&P 500 ETF is market cap weighted. That means if $100 billion goes into an S&P 500 ETF, 35 billion of that goes into the top seven stocks, and
Hmm.
60 billion goes into the top 50 stocks, which just is self-fulfilling because those big stocks are only getting all that money because they're big stocks and they get bigger, right? So it's this huge, and then so that's all happened, and then you've had the madness of crowds point I made, and then you've had every other asset and allocator in the world has just gradually been sucked into the great gaping maw of American equities because it's like, oh my God, America's delivered 14% annualized returns and I'm Coots in London and I'm long UK equities and I don't have a big enough allocation to America. Sod that, front page news of the FT, Coots allocating everything to America.
Yeah.
Time and time again, people in Zurich, people in Singapore, Tokyo, Frankfurt, whatever. So that sucked all the money in. And then the other thing is hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars are run by hedge funds using leverage, of course, as well, on using algorithmic strategies. So something like 85% of all New York Stock Exchange trades are done by algorithmic, basically bots, really smart hedge funds,
Hmm.
loads of PhD physicists wasting their lives writing computer code to try and snip, a micro percentage return in a millisecond, how many hundreds of thousands times a week. An awful lot of those strategies are momentum-driven strategies. So basically, when there's a bid for markets for all the reasons I've already given, there's even more of a bid for markets because there's hundreds of billions of leverage and money coming out of the hedge fund world. So we have this enormous maelstrom
Hmm.
of this perfect storm of just unbelievable amounts of money going into all these companies. We have, I would say, 0.1% of financial commentators really understand this because they're, um, I think it takes a certain kind of mentality and also a certain kind of experience. Why do I feel this disproportionately? Because I've spent my life looking at UK smaller companies. So
Hmm.
UK smaller companies have been absolutely screwed. London, Britain is a 3 trillion-ish pound GDP per annum economy with
Hmm.
£4 to £5 trillion worth of assets in our pension and insurance funds, which doesn't include another trillion in, private high net worth family office or whatever or more. And last year, the London stock market raised 2.1 billion pounds from
We are going
IPO.
to get to this, Andrew, because I've had a very hands-on experience of last year, which which I just want to touch on briefly before we get.
Mm,
So I suppose just to play devil's advocate,
mm,
you make a case for why we could see, a really um, rapid cascading sell-off in the
yeah,
US equity markets. I
yeah.
suppose what's the other side of that is. Um, isn't there going to be just financial engineering that they're going to pull the rabbit out of the hat, and by any means necessary, the recovery
Yeah,
will be shaped?
yeah, which is what's happened, which is what happened in 2008, right? Is just liquidity to it, which is why you bloody own gold and silver.
Exactly. So
I,
whilst the recovery will bring back nominal value,
yes, but
um,
not real.
obviously every human being on the planet becomes poorer as a result of it,
Yeah.
and all the consequences that follow from that. I've got another American question before we move on. Then we're going to go to the UK point that you were making, which
Just
is
before you do that, can you
yeah,
hold that thought? Because I do want to just say what I'm not saying categorically is sell all your American equities. This
okay.
is this is the bit that people don't get. It's like well, I'm just saying that you need to have a 20 to 40 year time frame. You need to understand you're going to have massive volatility, and when this crash happens, you need to keep buying every single month.
Hmm.
But the way you protect yourself from this potential massive denouement and everything I'm saying is not by selling your American equities today, because they could well go. They've been at an all time high for 12 years, right? Oh, I'm selling them at 5,000, no, 6,000, no, 7,000. The way you treat this by having the right mix of assets and by making damn sure that you invest every month for a long
Yeah.
enough, and that I treat all of that in my books, obviously.
Perfect. That is very, very valuable. Very valuable. Um, so what we're seeing in the States, and I think it can be applied to other countries as well, is there's this kind of rising, there's this move away from globalization, there's this rising nationalism, and
Yeah,
I'm like not saying that with any tonality, but countries
yeah,
kind of thinking about their own natural resources.
yeah,
And so when I think about investment themes, when I re read your book, how do you think about a bucket you could broadly describe as special situations? So you're seeing a theme emerge before you. So
mm,
a theme that I see is that there is a complete shift that I haven't witnessed in my time in investing towards real assets.
yeah, exactly.
If you
Yeah.
think like gold and silver obviously got the headlines, but also you look at like copper, you look at all kinds of.
I've got two uranium investments which are now up like 900% or something in my pension. Right?
That's
I mean, it's
very interesting. I every year have this kickoff meeting, and it's only a bit of fun. I'm clearly not giving
mm,
financial advice or recommendations, but
mm,
I always kind of give just for fun. I always think of three assets just to own, put it in an ISA, and just
yeah,
have a bit of fun with it. And one of those was yellow cake this year because I think it
yeah,
probably has
yeah.
a pretty good future if we have a green future.
The much less risky one, again, not financial advice, although it's already up a lot, is Cameco, which is the world's biggest
Yeah,
producer
I
of
mean that's
uranium.
the
It's
biggest
listed in Canada. Yeah,
producer in the world, and it has all the
yeah,
contracts to supply all the utility
yeah,
companies. I mean, it's like the Leviathan, isn't it?
yeah,
But
yeah,
I suppose, what's your critique of an emerging investment theme that is
yeah,
under owned by investors are probably commodities, and if you think that is a
yeah,
viable emerging theme, like how do we for like the mere layman.
yeah.
I am not going to go and research and buy lots of
No,
individual commodity companies because I will get eaten alive. I will be
yeah,
savaged. So I look at like the Bloomberg Commodity Index and I think, well, is this is this an appropriate way to express this view? So pull that to pieces, Andrew.
yeah. No,
Commodity,
I love it.
is
So
that
the
a
first
theme?
thing,
And how would you,
smug,
if it was a theme, how would you express it?
Smuggus Maximus over here is going to say, look, so exactly a point. 99% of adults, intelligent people with great degrees or what educate or just not that they're incapable of doing it, just never going to spend enough time to learn enough about capital markets to make a substantive decision. Okay, this year I'm
Mhm.
going to put money into this theme, right? They're
Mhm.
just not. And if you try, you have a very, very high probability of lowering your through the cycle investment returns in your life and not getting as good a result at the end when you want to have lots of money as you would otherwise have got.
Mhm.
The way that you want to own that emerging theme is the way you want to own anything else is just make damn sure that you've got a big equity index, right?
Mhm.
And hedge with some gold. Because if you want to, is there any way of capturing commodities, just have some gold.
Mhm.
And so look, if because the other thing that's really important to stress about investment generally is there is a world of difference between a, if you like, a qualitative theme, like commodities are now, because of what's going on in the world geopolitically, we should buy commodities. Okay, that's like one opinion that you've got that's probably right. The world's going to
Mhm.
need more rare
Yeah.
earths and copper and
Yeah.
silver. That's the obvious one in the last few months.
Yeah.
That doesn't tell you anything about what the market value of all those things is already, right? Because what's almost certainly happened is that 10 years ago, people smarter than you or quicker off the mark than you started
Yeah.
thinking that and thought, well, 10 years from now, the world's going to have, 10 billion mouths to feed. And, wow, a lot of these satellite companies and these mobile phones that we're just beginning to develop seem to use a lot of silver. And so by the time that you go, oh, wow, the world probably needs more commodities, you're 10 years behind the pace on the trade, which
Yeah.
means that it's probably about time to start selling that theme because
Yeah.
they're massively overbought. And, and the only way that you can cater to that is being a very, very serious student of all things economic and understanding valuation multiples, for example. If you don't, I did a video last year, which is basically like, markets make millionaires, clickbaity title, because it was basically most people have no business going anywhere near single asset investment or single stock investment because if you don't know what net debt to EBITDA, net debt to EBITDA, return on capital employed, return on invested capital, PE ratio, what goodwill, what intangible assets versus tangible assets on a balance sheet. If you don't know any of that stuff,
Yeah.
you have no business being anywhere near any kind of I'm going to buy this particular investment, whether that's a commodity or a share. And one
Mhm.
of the tragedy, the reason people are like, I always say it's like passing a driving test, right? If you haven't studied how to drive a car and you haven't passed a driving test and you go out and drive on the road, you've got a pretty high chance of having a nasty accident, right? It's even more fierce in financial markets. If you don't know all of this stuff, and the funny thing is, it's the old Warren Buffett thing is a rising tide. It's only when the tide goes out you see who's swimming without their trunks, right? Is that at the moment there are loads of people in the crypto space and oh, I've got S&P 500, oh, I've bought loads of AI stocks, oh, I'm a genius and I'm up loads and they very quickly won't be anymore when the tide goes out, right? And so the antidote to all of that, and to be clear, I'm talking about investing, not trading, which I always say, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Trading is very difficult. Most people, empirically, 80% of people lose money when they trade.
Mhm.
Investing is not that difficult. It's no harder than learning how to drive a car to learn how to invest very sensibly. And you capture all of these big themes by owning a big global equity index and then hedging it with some gold and some other, this is a little bit more nuanced than that. And you do that for 20 to 40 years. And then these big substantive changes you don't need to think about. And you're
Yeah.
likely, you know, market returns are sort of between 8 and 12% per annum going back more than a century, depending on whether you're lucky, whether you started in a market bottom or a market top and how you've
Mhm.
allocated and how you moved during your life. Most investors make 2%, right?
Mhm.
Because of everything, because they go, oh, I'm going to buy some Apple today because I love
Yeah.
iPhones. That is
Yeah.
not a reason to buy Apple, right? Or the other one is the big fallacy is there's almost no relationship between the real economy and the stock market.
Mhm.
The British economy's crap. Therefore, I should sell the stock market. Yes, the British economy's crap. The stock market's just beaten the S&P for five years now.
Yeah.
The British stock market, but they're
Yeah.
not. COVID is here and everybody's dying in the streets. Definitely shouldn't buy stocks. And then America had two of the most strong up years in the stock market in the 2 years after the COVID crisis, right? There is very, very little relationship between those two because of all the things we're talking about. And now, yeah, sorry, I've just been monologuing for like 10 minutes. I'll
No,
shut
this
up
is
now.
good.
I had something
No,
else I
no,
was
no,
going to
this is
say.
good. One of the things I do want to do is I do want to signpost because I meant to do it earlier. Is I do want
Mm,
to sign because you've mentioned gold a few times now.
mm.
You have done a really excellent video on your YouTube channel, and at the end of the podcast, I'm going to signpost people explicitly to the YouTube channel because I actually think that's where people should start because there is so much
Yeah, me too. I
value.
work very hard on it, so I want lots of people to go and look at it.
And there are some really good themes emerging in it, and in particular, because you've mentioned it a few times around gold in
Mm.
the you know, I think for most people, the best place to own gold is in your ISA, tax free. It's liquid. There's no personal risk taken. So yeah, I think
Well, yeah, yeah. Well, hang on. Although I do want to just get out there with what's
okay.
going on in the gold and in the precious metals market at the moment. And this sounds very conspiracy theory-ish, but an awful lot of things are happening at the moment which sounded conspiracy theory-ish, a few years ago.
Yeah.
Like, right, a reduction in the lifetime limit for pensions. Like,
Yes. Yeah.
if you'd said to a wealthy person 20 years ago, well, you basically only have a pathetically small amount of money you can put in your pension and it will be taxed at a pathetically small level, very, very harshly. They've said the government will never do that. They've already done it, right? And so many things we think of conspiracy theories are going to happen. But the the gold and silver price is so strong at the moment that
Mhm.
and I have made this playlist about it. I think I've done 5 videos on how to buy gold, like why to
Yeah.
buy gold and how to buy
Yeah.
gold. And and it does treat all of this like I think if people want to take it seriously, they really should have some physical because I do worry. I mean, I worry for my own personal ETF holdings in my pension and my ISA. In 1933, FDR basically compulsorily purchased all private gold holdings off Americans at
Hmm.
a rubbish price.
Yeah.
Can you imagine how frustrated you've been if you owned a load of gold, you'd up loads, it was a big part of your net worth, and then by law, you had to
Yeah. Yeah.
take it to a bank in your local town and sell it to the government and given the direction of travel, I fear that that's something that might happen. But,
Very interesting.
or
Okay. Well,
ETF,
as
yeah. Anyway, but
as I say, go to the YouTube channel. I'm going to put the link below and explore Andrew's videos on them. I want to just have like a minute on the UK because
mm,
I feel like I'm pulling a hand grenade and throwing it now because I know the strength of feeling you have around this.
yeah,
But let me kind of position this insofar as a friend of mine sold his business for a life-changing amount of money, and he
yeah,
invited me to attend an angel investing group with him, and it was really fascinating, and I've learned a lot from it.
mm,
And I read the book on it before I went, good student doing all the research. You invest in 10 projects and, one will be the great unicorn and you'll lose
yeah,
money.
exactly. The VC model, basically.
Yeah, and I could see it, and I learned two interesting things, some good news and some bad news. Do you know the good news? And this is like an optimistic theme. Is
Yeah,
there when that door closed and the entrepreneur left the room,
yeah,
the quality of the conversation was actually really compelling, and
right.
people were coming from a perspective of. Like they weren't throwing them under a bus. They weren't taking the mick out of them. They were like looking at the
Yeah,
business case, and you know, some things were clearly uninvestable. But the one thing I took away was I was really encouraged by the quality of the dialogue after the investor had left. That there is an appetite to invest in businesses
yeah,
in the UK.
absolutely. Yeah,
Um, and like the best, and genuinely, I found this really heartwarming was like a business had pitched, and like the group were just couldn't get across the line on it. No, nobody was willing to like lead the charge. And a
yeah,
really interesting conversation then emerged where like, one of the kind of lead angels said, he said, look, we can't invest in this business, but do you know what? Let's not give him what he wants. But why don't we just do a little syndicated loan? We'll all put in X,
yeah,
and we will get him back in and say, look, we're not going to give you what you want, but what we're going to do is we're going to give you this. We're going to create this syndicated loan. It's not what you want, but
we're going to coach you,
if
presumably, and help you.
yeah, if
Yeah,
you can get from point A to point B, and you
yeah,
can use this, and I'm going to give you this money on the basis we know we're not going to get it back. But if
yeah,
you can get to point A and you can come back in here and show us you've got from point A to point B,
yeah,
only burning this amount of money, we will
yeah,
then have the conversation with you again about what you actually want. And
exactly.
I was like so chuffed by it. I was like, that actually genuinely brought me happiness because it was
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
and everybody knew they were losing money that day. Like, in the sense that there was no real, they weren't doing it to make the money. At that
Well,
point, they were
I
doing
have
it
this.
out of some sort of civic, I don't know.
Yeah, exactly. And not putting the ladder up. What's it? Paying it forward or whatever. I mean, like, and by the way, I have this. I have this with certain family members who are very, very cynical about rich people. As a lot of people are, right? And I,
Yeah.
I've been lucky enough in my career to work with several billionaires, lots of centimillionaires. You know, it's just the nature of working in the city and raising money for companies on the stock market and stuff. And I have met an awful lot of extremely kind, motivated, decent human beings that have
Yeah,
made a lot of money because they've created a lot of value and they've
yeah,
then paid a lot of tax.
yeah,
And they do exactly that. They mentor young people. They are angel investors in businesses they know probably have a pretty high chance they're going to lose all their money.
yeah.
But they've made quite a lot of money and they want to support X number of young entrepreneurs coming through. They support them with time, they support them with capital. And Britain has such a corrosive, in my experience, totally incorrect opinion of these people that they're,
And I think
evil.
there's also the thing that amongst that demographic and no doubt others as well is that there is a willingness to invest in people that
Yeah.
even if your plan is not the greatest plan on
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
if you are able to articulate the vision and you come across as like a good human being,
Mm.
there is a possibility, I would say a reasonably high possibility that somebody will invest in you, even if they think,
Well,
I'm not sure you're going to go the distance, but I kind of like you. I trust
look, and
them.
that's another reason. I know you wanted to talk about tangible advice for young people in an AI world and jobs and blah blah blah.
Yeah.
And we were sort of talking about hamster YouTube channels earlier. But one of the, if I've got family friends who are in their late teens or early 20s or whatever, apart from saying, read my book, obviously. But the sort of tangible life advice is one of the single most important things. And again, it goes back to financial markets and the merits of being financially literate. But this is quite advanced financial literacy. But is the fundamental insight that if you understand enough about how companies are valued and how shares work, equities, right? Then the only thing that stands between you and potentially the life of your dreams, if you understand that, is going and talking to enough rich people and a good business plan, right? And the reason for that is if you have an idea where you can go to a very wealthy group of people, you can curate the interest of wealthy people. You can find them on LinkedIn. You can find them through friends of
Yeah.
friends or elderly relatives, mates, or what. And by the way, that's a huge job. You've got to be very organized. Have a great big Excel spreadsheet of hundreds
Yeah.
of people and their email address, and maybe have a newsletter or that's. This is why most people fall at this hurdle. But if you also know how to basically the present value of an early stage business like an angel investment or a VC investment is basically the expected future value haircut back to the current day. So if you think you can build a business that's worth 5 million quid
Mhm.
based on a revenue or profit multiple, and these are all things people have to understand. If you discount that back to today, where it's just a twinkle in your eye and an idea, you say it could be worth 1 million quid. It's got like a 20% chance of being worth 5 million quid 4 or 5 years from now. So I think I can argue to a sophisticated, wealthy person it's worth 1 million quid.
Mhm.
I'm going to sell 20% of that for 200 grand, which
Mhm.
means that now the day after I finish that, I have 200 grand. And I'm
Yeah.
going to pay myself 40 grand of that a year for the next few years. And I'll keep, and the rest, there's a detailed business plan about what you do with the rest of the money on advertising and stationery and internet
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
office, whatever. But the broad point is there is nothing standing between anyone and their future dream other than an idea, the ability to execute, an understanding of how company valuation works and how equities work. One of Britain's tragedies is like 0.00001% of adults ever bother to figure that stuff out. And then
So
they go,
that's
fucking rich people, and it's
That's
like,
the good, so that's the good news, Andrew, and I'm
yeah,
now going to allow you to give us a sentence on the bad news, but I'm fearful to open this floodgate, but I feel like I
yeah,
need to
okay.
allow you to do it. Is what I realized having gone to a few of these meetings, had read the leading book on it as well, though, is like what realistically, ladies and gentlemen, is our exit here? Because in times gone by, the exit for angel investment in a UK business was an IPO. And when I
Or a
was
trade, well, probably more likely a trade buyer, right?
Yeah, a trade by,
The lucky few got, even back in the day when we had an IPO market, yeah.
but there was at least the narrative that in
Yeah,
theory there could be an exit through an IPO.
yeah, yeah.
And you look at the UK, and even before I delved into the videos that you've put on your YouTube channel, which are absolutely eye-opening in that respect.
Mm.
Even I knew the IPO market in the UK was dead. And was only I've touched upon that in the late 90s in practice, and then moved on to
Yeah,
something
yeah,
else. Um,
yeah.
but give us a sentence. It can be a long one if you need it, Andrew, on why it is so bad that the UK stock market is not held in the esteem that it is, and what this means in real terms for the UK.
Well, I mean, as you know, one of my recent videos, I reckon it's cost the UK 20 trillion pounds in the last 30 years. The UK could have been, with fairly conservative assumptions, which I set out in. So I've done a video series of them, which is basically it's arguing the rise of passive investing has killed the UK active equity scene, which has killed the IPO scene. There's a lot more to it, but so that right now is 5 videos that are about 12 to 15 minutes long each of them, and I show how this theme, this reality, has cost the UK 20 trillion quid, which, by the way, is £460,000 per working age British adult of 43 million British adults, right? So our stupidity, our terrible policy decisions and regulatory decisions, going back to Blair and Brown, basically, but under this is not
Yeah,
party political, it's been under
yeah,
every single party in the time since, but just abject stupidity, a total failure to understand capital markets, a total failure to look at the merits of equities over 2 centuries since they're invented.
yeah,
Really, really stupid people. I'm sorry, you can tell I'm so angry about it because it's killed great swathes of the British economy. It's part of why, by the way, it's immeasurably more important than Brexit.
yeah,
Whether you're positive or negative on Brexit, Brexit is a sideshow compared to this. Brexit gets all of the oxygen. It's a bit like, as a great example was homicide in America is like 0.1% of deaths or something compared to cardiac arrest and whatever, lung cancer. It's 0.1% of deaths in America annually. These aren't the right numbers, but the
yeah,
point is right. And it's like 45% of press coverage, right?
yeah, yeah,
And I
yeah,
would say Brexit's the same. Brexit's like you know, because the numbers are all bullshit anyway, right? It's, a Remainer economist says this, Brexiteer economist says that, but
mhm,
and then all people preach that as gospel. Nobody knows. Nobody knows what the counterfactual is, right? But what I can tell you is the destruction of the UK equity market in the last 30 years, which is very easy to point to, and all the numbers there, and these numbers are not questionable because it's like there were 3,250 companies on the London stock market. There are now less than 1,600.
mhm,
Fact. Like in 2005, we raised 20 billion quid and did hundreds of IPOs. Last year, we raised 2 billion, and Rachel Reeves is so unbelievably clueless, she was crowing about it on social media.
yeah,
It's like, if you think it's good that in a £3 trillion economy with 4 to 5 trillion of assets under management, the UK was able to raise £2 billion for new companies on our stock market last year, you're mental.
yeah,
You are either incompetent or dishonest. It's factually one of the two, you
yeah.
know. But anyway, um,
I wanted
so
you to get that off your chest, but
yeah, yeah,
but I also want to like then segue into something like close to home, which is
mm,
you look at the challenges that UK businesses, and I want to end the podcast on a positive and optimistic note
yeah.
because
We will, we can, we
but
will,
in
we
both
can.
our hearts we're
Yeah, yeah,
optimists, and I
yeah.
know that you
Exactly.
share that worldview. But so last night I read that a really fantastic restaurant that a friend of mine had closed their doors, and they
Yeah,
did the press release yesterday. And
yeah,
uh, this I think takes it down to like a ground level. So
yeah,
this is a female founder, and you walked into the restaurant, and she employed lots of young people, probably more young people than she should have done. There seems to be a lot of staff on hand for the size of the
yeah,
restaurant. Very
yeah,
minimalistic restaurant, and you could tell the team were happy. You could
yeah.
just tell they were buzzing. They were enjoying
Exactly.
the jobs.
Great place to work. Really good
Right. They,
mates.
they, they were
Exactly.
like they were, you could tell there was this real bond between them. They really felt like they were doing something. And this is her sentiments that, came out in the press release. This is no longer the right time to own an independent restaurant. Under current conditions, they cannot survive, and the recent budget confirmed what so many of us knew: no meaningful help is coming to hospitality.
Mm.
And then she goes on to say, the experience of being here, the harsh reality of building a business no longer stacks up. And this is the bit that I like really jarred me, having had an amazing time there, was being an award-winning, popular, admired, and loved is no longer
A guarantee of
is
success.
no longer profitable.
Yeah.
As an industry, we have to be honest that most of us have not truly been okay since COVID.
Mm,
And that is my experience of all the
mm,
hospitality businesses that we see, that they haven't been able to recover from COVID. And what I find, and there is a question at the end of this, is
mm,
she finishes on, I think, like a positive note, which she says, "Look, I'm going to keep cooking, I'm going to keep building, I'm going to keep creating." And
mm.
the impression you get is that she needs to find a vehicle to express her creative outlets. So I think that I provide that as an illustration of what you're talking about in a big macro level, down to what is actually happening to human beings
Yeah,
in the cities, towns and cities we live in. I suppose the question I have from you for you on this is, we talk a lot about investment, but one of the things that you and I don't talk about is entrepreneurship particularly. And we
mm,
are both entrepreneurs,
mm,
and so this is a talented female founder who has had to jettison her business, fire her
yeah,
employees, hand back the cafe. And there's a lot of that going on in the UK.
massive.
And I
Yeah.
think her sentiments that it hasn't been easy since COVID is really realistic. So what advice would you have for entrepreneurs going through a challenging time, who, perhaps do feel a bit unloved by the current administration? I don't want to get into like the politics of it, but like, let's just assume they don't feel particularly loved by the current administration.
Yeah, yeah.
What advice would you have to entrepreneurs, like her, who need to bounce back, who need to reinvent, who need to, kind of do that reset? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, that's such a tough question. Candidly, I eat my own cooking on that very question every day because that's what I'm going through. I'm 4.5 years into building an FCA regulated investment management business, which we use social media as our front end, and my books are, generate a small amount of money, which ballasts the rest of the business. But we're still loss making, and I don't pay myself. And I'm actually not afraid to say that,
Mhm.
because I'm very confident I will get there. There are all sorts of fundamentals around what we're doing. We've put building blocks in place. I can raise equity if I need to, all that stuff. So, but advice that I have to adhere to myself is, my God, you have to be psychologically strong. You literally have to look through all the darkness, all the negatives, all the endless hundreds of hours of work you have to do for Companies House and HMRC and FCA and the red tape. I mean, you've no doubt been through this. A lot of your audience have this, this ID verification with Companies House that all directors just had to do. I
Yep.
mean, it is just endless, right? And so, I mean, look, I meditate, I walk, I eat quite well, I try to get loads of sleep. I mean, that's all a bit spurious, but my God, I wouldn't be able to do what I'm doing if I didn't have.
That is not spurious. That's
Right.
not spurious. Like, that's the
Yeah.
fundamentals. Walking, nature, eating well, family,
Yeah.
love.
I think, happiness is such an ephemeral thing, but, or contentment at the very least. But what I've made this point before, um, it's something you have to really study and really work at. And
Hmm.
I think one of the, Britain has a mental health epidemic. Britain's got more millions of people signed off work. Britain's got all these young people who are depressed and on a PIP or whatever it's called.
Hmm.
And I think it sounds a bit harsh, but I think that's because an awful lot of them have never made a serious study of the biological aspects of sunlight and this harmonizing with the circadian rhythms and getting outside and 10,000 steps a day and diet and nutrition and microbiome and dysbiosis and all much of which I wrote about in my third book, by the way, Our Future Biotech. But and exercise. And I mean, frankly, if you're not exercising, you're not getting outside, and you're playing video games all night, and you eat really badly, and you don't read anything, so you've got no job prospects, and you're not dating because of all of that, and all of that stuff. Funnily enough, you're going to be depressed. Should the rest of society pay for you? Like, call me harsh, but I'm not sure they should. But I think if you go and say I've got a serious problem depression wise, and I need help from the state. I think the state should say, okay, if you're doing all of these things already and you're still depressed, then we'll help you. If you're not doing any of them, you don't get any money. Call me harsh, but that's what I think because that's what I have to do, and that's what everybody I know does.
There's I got a great revelation from a book called, I think it was called The Happiness Advantage, which,
Mm,
in the final chapter gives this great revelation, which is there's scientific evidence to show that happy people have much better outcomes across the board of everything they do in life.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
there's a strong argument to say focusing on happiness is like the hack. That is the
Yeah,
secret.
yeah.
Is
Well,
if
no, but crucially, but then there's a great idea, which is the founding fathers of America, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness is like
yeah.
on the whatever. And they said that one of the chief sources of unhappiness is the pursuit of happiness, ironically,
All right.
because it implies you don't have it. Like,
Okay.
but I look, that's a kind of esoteric philosophical point. I agree. My point is, like any other skill in life, whether it's finances or going to the gym or, that's all wrapped up in it, you
Mhm.
need to study and learn. Like, how does your brain work? How does nutrition work? How does, if you have a compromised gut flora, you have a thing called dysbiosis, you're more likely to be depressed. If you're eating the wrong foods, you're going to compound that. If you have dysbiosis, even if you eat a really healthy diet, you will your body can't assimilate the nutrition, so you don't get any benefit, which is why so many people try so hard with diets and fail because they've got dysbiosis and they don't know what dysbiosis is, right? But
Mhm.
this is all information. If you have 8 hours of screen time a day and play
Mhm.
video games into the night and don't sleep until 3 in the morning, you're
Mhm.
going to be depressed. If you don't walk at least 6 or 7 thousand steps every day, you're more likely to be depressed. But these are all things that require quite a lot of work and knowledge and wisdom to put like a big list together that you said, right, these are the list of all the things that I need to do so that I maximize the chance that physiologically I'm at least okay and ideally a little bit better than okay, right? And the vast majority or a huge percentage of the British population is not doing any of them and doesn't and is wrong about loads of them. Like properly wrong, like
Mhm.
180 degrees wrong about oh, if I do this, like for example, wow, we're really going philosophical. This is a really interesting one. We've sort of gone very off piece, but I'm enjoying it, and I hope I don't get like cancelled for all of this. But
Okay, I think you
but
will.
like the the sort of um designer labels and designer clothes and like being really showy on it, being on Instagram and showing all your friends and feeling good about yourself that you're in business class or that all these appalling modes of behavior will not make you as happy as and by the way I'm not religious but going to church like
Mhm.
empirically or being part of a community like a church like community or playing in a sports team or whatever. So you see great swathes of young people doing stuff that the scientists, psychologists have been telling us for 30 years that does not make like conspicuous consumption and
Mhm.
competing with other people on which designer clothes you wear.
Yeah.
And of course, in very more often than not, going into high levels of debt
Mhm.
and screwing yourself financially for the rest of your life in order to portray this false narrative of who you are on social media. It's nuts. It's like, no, don't do that. If
Yeah.
you do that, you won't be happy. Like,
And the opposite side of that coin is what you've alluded to is community. Like community is the
yeah,
single biggest driver of well-being across all the measurements. I want to
yeah.
transition this to the final couple of questions, which is um, with all this in mind, we have you ever read the book The Sovereign Individual?
No, but I think it's lurking on my bookshelf there. I'm certainly
So
aware of it.
I read it years and years ago, and there were there were three things that I learned from it, which is one, at some point there'll be a global decentralized currency, presumably Bitcoin ticks that box.
Mm.
That nation states will eventually start competing for the brightest and the most well capitalized people. We can see that.
We're there already. We're
Whether
there already, right?
whether it's the
Yeah.
Middle East or whether it's, the humble offerings from Portugal, where they're
Argentina.
yeah.
I reckon for the next 20 years, Buenos Aires is probably going to be one of the best. 20 years from now, if you go to Buenos Aires now and start your life there and get property, 20 years from now, you'll be in an amazing position, and Britain will be some sort of, post-apocalyptic hellhole unless we're
But I
lucky.
hope not. And the third thing that I took from this book is they talk about the new Luddites. So people
Mm.
who have such a fear of technology that
Yeah,
they want to attack the factories and all kinds of things. And they say,
yeah,
look, they'll and I'm obviously taking a broad brush approach. It was a long time since I wrote the book, but the population will bifurcate, those that believe in
yeah.
technology and those that don't. And um, obviously, we hear a lot of discussion around AI, and there's the camp thing, which for full disclosure, I think I'm probably in, which is I do think it's going to enhance the quality of human life, like
Yeah,
medicine and medical care and all of that stuff.
yeah.
And then there's the people who think it's all, it's the end of the world, it's going to be the zombie apocalypse, and it's going to be the
Yeah.
end of times. I suppose just practically, if you're speaking to a young person, and let's put, somewhere between 18 and 25, and they're
Mm,
embarking into this world,
mm.
what practical advice would you give them in this world of AI and technology? Like, what advice would you give them about entering the workplace, about meaningful work, about entrepreneurship? Like, how would you get them to
Yeah, it,
point the ship?
it's really tough because I am like you. I think we'll muddle through to a place some years from now
Mm.
where we'll have amazing lives. We'll have robots caring for elderly. We'll have, and doing the sewers and
Yeah,
horrendous, dangerous jobs like offshore oil platforms. They'll all be done by robots, and humans will very likely be enormously well. To Musk's point about cost down on everything,
yeah,
if technology, AI, and robotics largely applies to the refashioning of the periodic table and our natural environment, meat and crops and metals and buildings and power, and if the technology delivers on its promise, we could all basically, you could have, because the other thing is, by the way, the more sophisticated and wealthier a society gets, the more its birth rate drops. Like we've seen
Mhm.
that for the last two
Yeah,
centuries, right?
yeah,
So there's actually a kind of halcyon future where there are like 2 billion people on the planet Earth, each of whom have what would in today's money would be like £1 million a year of income equivalent in terms of the cars they drive, the size of their house, the quality of their food, the quality of what they do every day. Um, and that's what technology has delivered. And by the way, we live massively in harmony with the planet. And global warming is no longer a problem, and environmental despoilment is no longer a problem because we've
yeah.
solved all these problems. I think there's a very real chance that happens. You know what's interesting though, is I think that the we will likely have more mental health issues. Because basically, if you took somebody out of a time machine in 1800 and put them into 2025,
Yeah.
that's what our lives would look like to them.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
They'd be like, "You're kidding! You have a stuff
Well,
thing called a car? You've been to Spain on holiday? You have steak twice a week? Like, oh my
that's
God!"
that's embedded in the question as well. In the
Yeah,
my personal view is that even now we have a crisis of meaning.
an
In the
existential malaise. But my point is, you can. In what I was, the tangible answer is very difficult. And there's so much to unpack here. And sorry, I'm cutting across you, but the answer to that existential malaise and a crisis of meaning is education.
Mhm.
Like if you actually bother to get into all the great religions of the world, why they exist and what they're all about, or poetry or literature, or get really into movies or really into photography or really into health and fitness, if you do health and fitness and you flood your body with endorphins, like you go surfing like that, you're unlikely to be a depressed person purely because you're a surfer,
It is
right? And you actually
impossible to be depressed and go
correct. And
surfing.
it's like, if you sit on your ass and do 8 hours a day of screens every day and you've never read a book and you eat really bad food, you're never going to find meaning. Your right brain side of your life's going to be screwed. You're never going to date. You're never going to find a significant other. But it does, and so I think to your point about people, you have the neo Luddites and people who embrace technology. I think you also have people who just aren't willing to make themselves wise and learn the nuts and bolts of what makes you happy and fulfilled, and people who are willing to do that, and people who aren't, and that's bifurcating as well, right? People who have a victim mentality that my life's shit because it's everybody else's fault and it's rich people, and people who go out and take on the world and become wealthy and and I'm not look. It's not black and white. There are grey areas. There are some people who do a bit of that and then fail and move into that camp and get depressed for a few years. And there are also seasons of your life. But I think, I guess one of the most important words I think about all the time is agency.
Mm.
You've never had more agency. To your point about the sovereign individual, factually, like if you were born in a rural community in Yorkshire in 1800,
Yeah,
your life prospects were you could have worked as hard as you bloody possibly, and you're probably going to die in your late 40s.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
And life was nasty, poor, brutish, solitary, short, cold, horrendous, dangerous, right?
Yeah.
If you're born in the same rural community in 2000 or 2010 or 2020, your life prospects are immeasurably better,
Yeah.
but you're going to just spend your life vaping and watching TV and moaning about shit on social media. And funnily enough, you're not going to be very happy.
And,
You know,
and
and you're
and
not going to become
yeah.
wealthy either. And so yeah, it's really harsh. But just tangibly though, I also make the point in 1800, like 98% of people worked on the land, right? And if
Yeah.
you'd said somebody in 1800, by the year 2020, 0.5% of people will work on the land. They'd be like, oh my God, what are like 98% of the population going to do? Because we didn't know what a biotech entrepreneur was, or a hotelier, or a restaurateur, or a travel blogger, or a, you know, there's this idea called the lump of labor fallacy. It's like this, when you think about AI or a new technology, you basically think that labor is fixed. So if a machine comes along that takes labor off us,
Mhm.
then all the people like bus drivers or taxi drivers if you have self-driving vehicles, right? But there's the lump of labor is a fallacy because labor grows because there are thousands and thousands of jobs. You know,
Mhm.
TV producers, airline pilots. There are tens of millions. I think I'm right in saying there's like maybe 10 million airline pilots in the world or whatever the number is. Probably not
Yeah.
that big, but it's, you know, a few million airline pilots, let's say.
Yeah.
Um, Nobody, you know, in 1900, there was no even twinkling in the eye of something called an airline pilot. And now, along the way, you have these big dislocations, and candidly, and I will come to an end of my massive comedy monologue. But you know, I was just trying to like get verbal diarrhea this all out at you with apologies. But that notwithstanding, I do think we have a lot to look forward to, say for a big apocalypse. I do think the risk of nuclear Armageddon, by the way, is vastly more consequential than the risk of anything to do with the environment or global
Yeah.
warming.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, seriously. And I do think that is a risk. And that's, you know, we've had a few lucky escapes in the last century, and let's hope that carries on happening. But say for an apocalyptic scenario you can't legislate for, and if it happens, you know, you'll have 10 minutes, drink some
Yeah.
whiskey, and
Yeah.
wait for
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
bomb or whatever. But say for that, I do think the world's going to get immeasurably better. Along the way, though, I think it's very difficult to be prescriptive about the right course to chart for young people. Like, what should you study? What should you?
Mhm.
Because there is going to be a hiatus, you know. And by the way, our government's making it immeasurably worse. You know, AI is bad enough, but all the policies you were talking about at your friend's restaurant earlier, nobody can hire young, inexpensive people now because it's too expensive. So nobody gets any on-the-job training, you know, early in their career, which means the whole every place of employment's hollowed out. There are no young people there because they can't afford any young people as a business,
Mhm.
which means they don't learn any skills, which makes it really boring for older people who quite like a few younger people around. And you know, there are all sorts of. But if I have well, two things tangibly. One we'd already talked about earlier. Bloody learn about equities, because if you you know, if you are able to understand how to write a business plan for an idea, even if you don't have one yet, there's other people's money, and there are lots of wealthy people in the world, rightly or wrongly. So that, you know, if you have that skill, you're going to be much better off than somebody who's just, oh, please, sir, give me a job, right? So learn that. And the other one is read books. And from the bottom of my heart, I mean, obviously I'm an author, but there's some of my publisher, Hodder and Stoughton, have a campaign at the moment, which is basically the evaporation of reading in young people, right?
Mhm.
Reading for pleasure is like the lowest it's ever been, etc., etc. And it's basically saying that from the record of psychologists, a long form book reading. I'm not talking about like TikTok videos and, you
No,
know,
no. Please.
articles on
Yeah.
the Sun or the Daily Mail. I'm talking about proper
Yeah.
300-page books, right? Long form reading is more than educational background, where you grew up, the affluence of your parents, the education levels of your parents, all of these other factors.
Mhm.
Reading long form books is the highest correlate for life success and wealth and happiness and health. The number one thing, reading long form books. So, in whatever happens, if you have a habit of long form books, you'll be fundamentally more informed than all the people who aren't, which means you'll be able to navigate whatever the hell's going on in a new AI era economy, right?
I'm I I'm definitely taking that answer. I think that's an excellent answer, and it leads nicely into my final question, which is
So can I just give you, just because I really want to get this out, and this won't take long. The other thing, just to bear in mind, which is really uplifting, is there's a guy called Kevin Kelly who founded Wired magazine,
Mhm.
and he wrote an amazing piece called 1000 True Fans. And I'd recommend everybody goes and reads that if you're worried about AI and about the future, because the basic thesis is if you can build somehow through social media nowadays, obviously, with whichever platform,
Hmm.
1,000 true fans. If you
Yeah.
can get that tiny audience, don't try and build $100 million business. Don't try. If you can get 1,000 people who love what you do, whether you're an artist or a
Mhm.
banker or whatever the hell you sell cat brushes. There's a woman who's got
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
multi-million-pound business. She's really good at cat brushes,
Yeah.
like whatever, like random thing. 1,000 true fans paying you £6 a month
Yeah.
is £6 a month, which is better than
Yeah.
most jobs pay. But if you can get 1,000 people to pay you 200 quid a year, it's 200 grand a year, right? And I think that's so read books, learn about equities and how to build a business model, and look at Kevin Kelly's 1,000 True Fans if you're
I,
young and starting out.
I think that those are excellent pieces of advice. I came to that last one through Tim Ferriss. Tim Ferriss is a big
Yeah.
fan of that article in particular, and he often will republish it because it
Mm.
is like that's just the key to success. It's a really good article and it's worth seeking out. Segueing to the kind of the final question then is obviously. You are a very accomplished writer, and I've never asked this of you, but I'm
Mm.
interested just, for a minute to give us your writing method. So, like a la Tim Ferriss, like Tim Ferriss is famous for doing these projects where he literally cuts himself off from society.
Yeah.
Um, and he goes and, does whatever he needs to do. Like, what is your writing method in terms of, so for a start, do you dictate or do you type? Do you um, hire a villa in Mallorca and fly out there and leave your phone in London? Like, how
No.
writing method? And for those of us, and I include myself in this, who aspire one day possibly to write a book, um,
Mm.
you know, advice.
Okay, okay. I'm very happy to do that. It's funny. A friend of mine is a fiction writer and she sold like hundreds of thousands of books. I think even low millions by now. I won't
Wow.
embarrass her by saying who she is. And once I said, "Oh yeah, I think I'm going to go and you know, go out to Northern Ireland where my grandparents are from and take a little villa on the Antrim coast." And she's like, "What a load of bollocks." She's like, the whole romantic idea that you kind of go somewhere in the wilderness and it's like, no. And she said this to me years ago when I was early in my career, and I was like, wow, it made me laugh. Because so here's my number one piece of advice for being able to write. If you have children, go to bed the minute your children are in bed. I'm not kidding you. I've now been 4, 5, 6 years. I go to sleep at 8. I'm asleep between 8 and 9 p.m.
Yeah.
every night, 360 days a year. My poor wife doesn't get to go out for like enjoyable date dinners very much, special occasions, weddings, whatever. But seriously, like 360 days a year for, I don't know, maybe as long as 7 or 8 years now, I'm asleep between 8 and 9 p.m., which of
Okay.
course means that I'm naturally awake. This morning I got up at 3 a.m. Literally through. I looked at my thing because I went to sleep at like 7 last night because I'm working on this presentation for Dubai next week and it's just been brutal. Trying to distill it all down, do a great job and be ready and stuff. So I've been getting up and I'm at work at my desk at 4 at the moment. But normally I try to be what I call a 9 to 5 or so. Sleep at 9, up at 5.
Hmm.
And then and the reason I say that is because if you just bloody sit down in front of a Word document at 5 in the morning when the house is quiet and the kids aren't around and whatever. By the way, my wife does get to go for really nice lunches. Like they make up for it, but we do really nice lunches at the weekends or whatever. But
Yeah.
we just don't really do dinners because of this. And also I finished my fourth book recently, and I'm not planning to do any more. I might accidentally slide down into doing one soon, but
Famous last words.
it might, yeah, she might have we might go out for a few dinners later this year. We'll see once I finish the next project I'm working on. But no, seriously, joking aside, be at your desk at 5 a.m. and start writing. Like, and then in terms of technique, I'm really old fashioned. I just use Word. But what I tend to do is the whole that editing is different to writing point is I think a really good one, which Tim Ferriss talks about, which is like splurge, like bullet points. Oh no, that topic. Oh, remember that quote from that book. I want to include that. And then just make a note. Don't find the quote. Don't slow yourself down. It's like, oh yeah, Abraham Lincoln said something about Henry Ford. Write that down. Bullet point, bullet topic. What am I going to? What are the? And then very soon you have like a Word document that's just a whole load of bullet points of these are the topics, and then you coalesce that into chapters and maybe sections. So
Mhm.
then you go, okay, chapter one is this thing that I'm going, and then my technique there is so there's a great quote from Dale Carnegie, the guy who wrote,
Yeah, of course.
which is something like, when giving a presentation, you should always remember tell them what you're going to tell them,
Hmm.
tell them what you told them, which is a really famous thing. And I think it's really good in a presentation, and it's really, really good in a book. And crucially, so at the beginning of the book is like, this is what my book's going to be all about,
Hmm.
right?
Yep.
This is what we're going to talk about in my book. And you try and make that as distilled and interesting as possible. Then in the middle of the book, this is what my book's all about with all the topics. And then at the end, you go, now my book that you just read was all about all of this. And it just beautifully lays up the intro and dovetail, brings it all together at the end. I think that's a really good schema. But crucially, I think that schema should then apply to each of your individual chapters as well.
Hmm.
So you start a chapter, it's like this chapter is going to be all about this. Then it's all about this. And in the end you go, this chapter was all about this. And that sounds so kind of Mickey Mouse and elementary, but you'd be amazed at how much more compelling it makes the read because you're like, oh yeah, okay, and whereas if you don't do that, a lot of lower quality books don't do that, and then they kind of just like, okay, well, hang on, what was that chapter about? And you kind of lose interest, and you. Whereas if you're like, okay, this chapter is about this, right? I'm now going to concentrate on this thing because that's what I'm going to learn in this chapter. And then you're like, okay, oh, in this chapter, yeah, that's what I learned in this chapter, and that was really interesting. And then same again in the next chapter. But just methodologically, once you've got that structure, there's no substitute for just. Can I swear? I think I already did it.
I
Just
think you can. You can.
yeah. Sorry about that. But just fucking writing. Like literally, I probably write at least 1,000 words every day, and sometimes 3 or 4 or 5,000. Whether that's blog posts or articles or scripts for videos or a book or whatever I'm doing, and it's just the ease. It's very hard to do that after lunch for me.
Yeah.
It's very hard to do that when you're on a podcast. Obviously, it's very but if you do it every single day between sort of 5 a.m. and 7:15,
Yeah.
1,000 words a day is 365,000 words a year, which is a shitload of books already.
Very
There you
good.
go.
That's lovely. That's like a little masterclass in writing a book. Andrew, I'm going to point people towards the YouTube channel because I think it's the best place for people to go. And also, in your YouTube channel is very well set up. So what it allows you people to do is then click to all the other resources. So I think that's where we'll send them.
Brilliant.
But it's like the final word is what are you optimistic about?
Yeah, look, big picture. I think there's a hiatus. No, so I try to divorce optimism about the species from optimism about the UK. I
Mhm.
do think the UK, the Tories were awful. Labour are even worse. I think we have a terribly, terribly incompetent political class, and I think sadly we also have, to my turkeys voting for Christmas point, we have an electorate now who are so they really genuinely don't understand so many of the fundamental mechanisms of how economics work, how wealth is created, and how better societies are built.
Mhm.
And I think Britain's going to get worse before it gets better. And ironically, the stock market's doing really well, which is
Mhm.
it's all about valuation, not about the economy, by the way.
Yeah.
So that's depressing. But then in terms of bigger picture, longer term, mankind as a whole, I think we massively the hedonic adaptation thing. I think we massively discount just how good everything already is.
Mhm.
Even if you're on minimum wage, if you're able to watch a sports team in the pub with your mates at the weekend, if you have a smartphone, if you watch Netflix, if you don't ever have to worry about starving. And I appreciate that there are a lot of financially challenged people on a lot of food banks in the UK, so that's not true of everybody. I think many millions of people in the UK actually have all of those things and they're still miserable. And I
Mhm.
think, don't be that person. I think just, and then realize that life's a journey and the compound effect of just getting a little bit better at each month, then you will get better. And I think the compound effect of what the main technologies, AI, robotics, biotech, quantum computing, etc. at the moment, I think it's going to materials science. I think there's going to be some. I wrote about it in my book, Our Future is Biotech, specifically pertaining to biotech. I think where humanity can go in the next few years exponentially is incredible. I think sadly, Britain's going to be nowhere near any of that because we've got the highest electricity price in the world. So all of
Mhm.
those technologies require cheap electricity. So we're going to be rubbish and
Mhm.
gaslight the population. We go, we're great, and our tech businesses are worth 2 and 6pence. Meanwhile, America's got 10 that have valued at several trillion. Are you fucking kidding me? Anyway, so there you go. I'm very bearish the UK, although I know I think you're the same with your network. I'm trying really hard in my own small way to do something about that tangibly. I'm not leaving. I'm writing
Mhm.
YouTube videos that hopefully help that.
Being
Um,
part of the solution rather than the problem.
yeah, exactly. But then I'm also being part. I'm going to the biggest world the biggest healthcare conference in the world, where on Monday I'm giving the keynote in the biotech track.
Mm.
And as a scaly-skinned economist and stockbroker who does not have a PhD, I will have massive imposter syndrome as I tell all these extremely clever clinicians and doctors and PhDs about why biotech's great when they all know way more than me about it. But I'm going to have a crack at it anyway,
Good
just to
on
bang the
you.
drum.
Well, look, good luck with that. And Andrew, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it. And yeah, this has been awesome. I've really enjoyed it.
Well,
It's
maybe we should do a
cool.
1 hour podcast once a year instead of a 2 hour podcast every other year, just for your poor audience.
Do you know what? 2 hours, 2 hours every year. Let's just do that. Let's just push the boat
Uh,
up. Look,
okay,
Andrew,
fine.
I'm gonna put a link to the YouTube channel, and I highly, highly recommend everybody checks it out. There's some really interesting stuff on it. And just thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it.
Brilliant. Thanks so much.
If you have enjoyed the podcast, which I hope you have, please subscribe to the podcast, leave a comment. If there's anything you want to expand upon the podcast, leave that in the comments as well. My thanks again to Andrew for coming on and giving us a tour de force. Thanks very much for listening. We'll speak to you very soon. Take care.